Hey everybody. I wanted to post a video because this stuff is kind of hard to talk about in discussion forums, but maybe post a video to talk about some of the aspects of formal versus informal poetry and things we can think about for when we start writing as far as how to structure, excuse me, how to structure our poems. And I tend to ramble on this, so I'm going to try to rein it in a little. And hopefully it can be clear as we move forward. So anyway, in the four poetry packets you've gotten so far, they move relatively chronologically, starting in the Renaissance and then into the late 20th century, 21st century too, I suppose. And one of the things I hope you noticed is there's a general movement away from formal poems. So when we start with Sonnet 73, a sonnet is, of course, a formal poem, and we sort of move into the realm of what we call free verse, which is informal poems. So a sonnet has rules, and anytime you write formal poetry, you have to follow the rules of the form, or you're supposed to anyway. A sonnet, for example, has 14 lines, and depending upon 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and depending upon whether you're writing a Shakespearean or a Petrarchan sonnet, the rhyme scheme is going to be different. In a Shakespearean sonnet, as you can see, the rhyme scheme is A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, G G, and then there's a volta before the last couplet, and the couplet, of course, is rhymed together. And so, of course, iambic pentameter is 5 metric feet, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed for each line of the poem. And while that is incredibly difficult to do, it does also force you, if you're writing a sonnet, for instance, it forces you to choose your words incredibly carefully and to obey a structure. When we get into free verse, some of the positives of free verse are that it is more natural. It gets us away from hard rhymed poems, which, it's very, very difficult to be original and rhyme a poem, because normally what happens at this point is we're reading a poem and we read a word that we know needs to be rhymed with. And if we can guess what the next line is going to be, or what the next rhymed word is going to be, then that's pretty boring, if you ask me. So free verse allows us to be freer. It also does not force us to be as careful, we think, with our selecting our words and trying to sort of parse things down. And I think that can be a problem for a lot of poets. So so if you choose to write formal poetry, there are positives and negatives to selecting formal poems as your style, and there are positives and negatives to selecting free verse. The negative also for most of creative writing students with formal poetry is that we tend to, and forgive me if I've said this in another video, we tend to write similarly to our influences and other writers that we've read. So if you're a creative writing student and you've taken English major or not, but you've taken survey courses and things like that, most of the poetry that you will have read will have been formal poetry. And what I get a lot of is 20-year-old students living in Atlanta in 2019 writing like they are British men and women living in 1695 or something like that. And we really want to avoid that and write like who we are. And so all of the poetry going forward is going to be I hope all of it. I shouldn't have said all. Most of the poetry we're going to read going forward is certainly going to be, late 20th and 21st century contemporary American poetry. So you can see sort of what's being written. I wanted to talk a bit about one of the aspects of formal poetry is that sometimes we break things into stanzas. So there's two different types of physical poems, right? There's what we call stichic poems, which is Stichic, stichic, which means that there are no stanza breaks. And then there's strophic poems, strophic, which are poems that are broken up into stanzas, which are like the paragraphs of poetry. And so if you're writing a formal poem, you might have, quatrains, which are 4 lines, or you might have couplets, which are 2 lines, or whatever. And even if it's unrhymed, you can write in stanzas. And one of the things that stanzas allow you to do is, again, like have a structure that you need to fit your words in. And that can be helpful to a lot of students. And so they don't have to be all the same length. So if you're writing a stanza poem, a lot of the question is, well, how do I know where to break a stanza? And the answer to that is that there really is no answer. A stanza can just sort of happen and it feel like a natural place to break. It doesn't work quite like it does in composition, where you have one major idea per paragraph or something like that. That does not have to be the case with poetry. Oftentimes what happens for me in the strophic poems that I write is that I just start writing in one stanza. Feels like it feels complete, whether it's 5 lines or 10 lines or 12 lines or whatever it is. And then I'll stop, and then I'll decide whether or not I want to write another stanza to try to match that one, or just write until it feels complete again. And so this feeling of completeness is something that comes with a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and just sort of being comfortable in your own skin as a writer. But again, you don't need to break any poems into stanzas. They can be not merely, but they can just be stichic and on their own. And we're going to take a look again at something like that in just a minute. And then I wanted to talk about lines. Okay, so I'm kind of obsessive about line lengths and line breaks. Okay, so if we look at this poem, it's Sonnet 73. If you look at the end of the first line, there is no punctuation. Or the second line, there's no end punctuation right here, after the D or after the G in behold or hang. And so when you read those lines, you're supposed to read right through into the next line, not stop. So the way you read the poem is supposed to sound like, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the bare ruin, which shake against the cold, etc. Bare ruin choirs where late the sweet bird sang. So because there's no punctuation at the end of the line, we call that enjambed. Okay, so that's an enjambed line. Enjambment is a technique where you don't punctuate the end of a line to force your reader to read right through. And as you can see, it helps you dull the harshness of some of the rhymes, as opposed to reading it like, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang, upon those boughs that would shake against the cold, bare ruin choirs where late the sweet bird sang. Like, so we don't want to stop at the end of each line if the punctuation doesn't tell us to. So that's enjambed, E-N-J-A-M-B-E-D. If you have a mark of punctuation like this comma or this period or whatever, that is an end stop, E-N-D-S-T-O-P. Obviously. And so you can do different things with those. So if you are thinking about, if you're writing formal poetry like a sonnet, you have to write 10 syllables per line, right, of iambic pentameter. If you're writing free verse, you don't have to do that. And so you have to start asking yourself, where do lines break? And that's a really good question. And I love thinking about line breaks. So, for instance, if we take a look at A Blessing by James Wright, one of my all-time favorite poems, we see that these lines are a vastly different length. We have a line that, at home once more they begin munching on young tufts of spring in the darkness, as one line. And then we also have into blossom as one line. And we ask ourselves, well, where do we break? And again, these are not hard and fast rules. These are just suggestions or feelings of completeness. Like a stanza, you might break it when you feel the stanza is complete. Again, in informal poetry, and a line you feel the same way. Generally speaking, you don't want to end on like a preposition like and or with or something like that in the middle of a sentence. I sort of feel like each line should have its own sense of completeness, even if it's not a complete thought. So if we look at, a few of these lines, let's try and find one that makes sense. Okay, so if we start the poem, just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, Twilight bound softly forth on the grass, and the eyes of those two Indian ponies darken with kindness. Just those first 4 lines. If we look at each line, each of them has a sense of completeness. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota. It's an idea that we get. Twilight bound softly forth on the grass. Perfect. And the eyes of those two Indian ponies, we see them, the 2 eyes of the 2 Indian ponies, darken with kindness. If we take, for example, the 3rd line, and we say, in the eyes of those 2, and we're to break it right there, Indian ponies darken with kindness would be the next line. And Indian ponies darken with kindness would be a decent line, but in the eyes of those 2 would be sort of an incomplete feeling, if that makes any sense at all. Again, it's like a slippery thing to try to talk about because everyone has different opinions on it. My thought is that what was put to me, I think early on in my writing career was a poet said, you should have an answer, right? So if somebody says, why did you, somebody maybe being me or somebody else, looking at your poems with you, says, why did you break the line there? The answer can never be, I don't know, right? So we're taking all of these things we've written. We started with writing about ourselves, and then longer short fiction, and then into flash fiction, and then into poetry. And poetry is the most condensed of all of the writing forms. And the more condensed it is, the more carefully you need to have thought about everything, from your word choice to your form to your punctuation and everything like that, and your line breaks. And so you should have a reason for breaking your lines where you break them. If you're writing formal poetry, that's your answer, right? Because it is, I needed a 10-syllable line, or I needed a 6-syllable line, or I'm writing a haiku or whatever. If you're writing in free verse, you should still have an answer. And that answer might be, it feels complete to me, and that's okay. But we need to start thinking about poetry in our words, in our writing, in terms of really getting down to the most minute and specific details, and be able to sort of justify why we've chosen to do what we do. So the answer should never be, I don't know. We need to think about our lines and our stanzas, and as pieces that make up the whole poem that we're trying to affect our reader with. Anyway, I think that's it for today. So I hope that's somewhat helpful and not just totally confusing. But we can take a look at the poems moving forward and talk about any questions you might have in our discussion forums for next week, or in any emails or whatever you might have for me. Okay, great.